Step into the hidden world behind the gilded crowns of medieval kings. Forget the romanticized castles and royal pageantry. Life on the throne was darker, twisted, and far more disturbing than most imagine. To be a king was to inherit not just power, but paranoia, fear, and cruelty. From childhood, princes were trained to kill, deceive, and trust no one, not even family. As rulers, they isolated themselves, surrounded themselves with spies, and punished betrayal with terrifying brutality. Mental illness, obsession, and extreme paranoia were common. Some kings executed entire families on a whim, while others withdrew from the world for years. Court life was a theater of manipulation and vice, where pleasure, obsession, and cruelty intertwined. In this series, we'll explore the human side of kings, their fears, obsessions, and the ways their dark minds shaped entire kingdoms. Prepare to step behind the throne and witness the disturbing reality of medieval power. This is the story of the disturbing lives of kings in medieval times, and it begins now. Born into blood. To understand the disturbing lives of medieval kings, one must first understand the world into which they were born. Royalty in the Middle Ages was not a ticket to comfort or happiness. It was a ticket to a life of relentless pressure, early indoctrination into violence, and a childhood stripped of innocence. From their very first cries, these children were not merely heirs. They were weapons in a larger game of power, and their survival was a delicate balance between fortune, family, and fate. A king's childhood was a paradoxical mix of privilege and peril. They lived in castles of stone and grandeur, attended by nurses, tutors, and attendants who ensured that their needs were met. Yet behind these protective walls, life was far from safe. Every action, every word, and every friendship could carry deadly consequences. Parents, nobles, and even siblings were potential threats, and betrayal often lurked where love should have been. For instance, Edward II of England suffered a childhood marked by political manipulation and the looming shadow of his father's ambitions, leaving him psychologically unprepared for the crown he would eventually inherit. Education for a young prince was never about play or curiosity. It was training for survival. From an early age, they learned to wield a sword and bow, to recognize enemies, and to negotiate with precision. History often glamorizes the chivalric education of these boys, but the reality was brutal. Combat training was harsh and often dangerous, leaving scars both physical and mental. They were taught to endure pain, suppress fear, and above all, to dominate. Failures were met with ridicule or worse, reinforcing the constant lesson. A king must be strong, or he would be destroyed. Yet, even more formative than martial training was the exposure to violence and death. Young princes were not shielded from the executions, punishments, and bloody spectacles that were a daily part of medieval life. They observed decapitations, hangings, and torture as lessons in obedience and control. Public executions were not merely entertainment, they were indoctrination. By witnessing the consequences of betrayal and disloyalty firsthand, these children internalized a worldview where life was cheap, fear was currency, and power was the only means of survival. Family dynamics, too, were steeped in tension. Royal parents were not necessarily nurturing in the modern sense. Kings and queens often treated their children as political tools, valuing their potential to secure alliances or expand dynasties over their emotional well-being. Siblings were competitors, cousins could be assassins, and even nurses or tutors could be agents of manipulation. Isolation was a constant companion. The young heir learned early that trust could be lethal, and affection was often a luxury they could not afford. And then there was the weight of destiny, the understanding that one day the child would inherit not just a crown, but the lives, loyalty, and fear of an entire kingdom. This knowledge created an environment of intense pressure. Anxiety and paranoia often began long before the throne was claimed, a slow poisoning of the mind that would only intensify with age. Some historians argue that this early exposure to stress and violence planted the seeds for the mental instability seen in monarchs like Charles VI of France, who would later descend into psychosis under the crushing burden of rule. Even celebrations, births, and royal ceremonies were colored by the shadow of danger. Nobles and advisors, always calculating, could use a child's vulnerabilities to manipulate the future king. Assassination attempts were not rare. Even infants were not safe from schemes designed to eliminate potential heirs. Being born into royalty was, in many ways, a lifelong sentence. A sentence to learn cunning, cruelty, and the constant art of self-preservation, before the child could even walk, speak, or understand the true nature of the world around them. By the time a prince reached adolescence, he had been immersed in a world of calculated cruelty, political games, and psychological training that would shape his every decision as king. There was little room for innocence, much less freedom. Childhood was a crucible, forging rulers in fire and fear, preparing them for a throne that would demand absolute dominance and unspeakable ruthlessness. To be born a king, in the medieval world, was to inherit more than power. It was to inherit a life where violence, betrayal, and paranoia were constants. Every lesson, every observation, every harsh word from a tutor or parent was designed to mold a mind capable of surviving the impossible pressures of monarchy. This was a life where blood was not only shed in battle, but flowed silently through corridors of stone, shaping the future rulers who would someday wield absolute authority. And in understanding this foundation, the brutal, isolating, and psychologically taxing upbringing of a medieval king, we begin to see why so many of these rulers were as terrifying as they were brilliant, as disturbed as they were powerful. The crown of madness. By the time a prince ascended to the throne, the seeds of psychological strain planted in childhood often began to bear their full weight. Being a medieval king was not just a position of power, it was an all-consuming force that preyed upon the mind. Isolation, constant scrutiny, and the crushing burden of responsibility frequently drove rulers into paranoia, depression, and outright madness. While the crown promised dominion over land and subjects, it often brought torment, hallucinations, and destructive obsessions that few outsiders could fathom. Mental health, of course, was poorly understood in the Middle Ages. Conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and severe anxiety were not recognized. Eccentric or violent behavior was often attributed to divine favor or divine punishment. A king, acting erratically, could be hailed as a visionary one day and condemned as possessed the next. Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, exemplifies the terrifying unpredictability that could grip monarchs. At times he believed he was made of glass, refusing to be touched for fear of shattering. At other moments, he wandered the halls of his palace in a state of violent mania, attacking his own courtiers. His illness did not just endanger himself, it destabilized an entire kingdom, leaving nobles to vie for control in his lapses of reason. Paranoia was perhaps the most insidious companion of kingship. Trust was a luxury, and suspicion was a necessity. Even the most loyal advisors could be seen as traitors, and every gesture, word, or glance could be interpreted as a threat. King Henry VIII of England offers a chilling case study. In his later years, he became obsessed with the loyalty of those around him, executing wives, friends, and ministers on the flimsiest evidence of betrayal. The court was a theater of constant fear, and the king, both feared and feared for, became a tyrant of his own mind as much as of his realm. Sleep deprivation, stress, and sensory overload amplified these conditions. Medieval kings often faced non-stop obligations, judging disputes, leading armies, negotiating treaties, and participating in endless ceremonial duties. These endless pressures created an environment where hallucinations, nightmares, and irrational fears could easily take root. In some cases, kings would spend days in isolation, surrounded only by the whispers of spies and the sounds of their own restless minds. The line between reality and delusion blurred, leaving rulers to act on visions and suspicions that were entirely their own. The crown itself was a source of psychological torment. It symbolized absolute authority, but it also symbolized absolute responsibility for life and death, both of the realm and of the king personally. Every rebellion, every failed harvest, every betrayal of a noble or ally could weigh on the monarch's conscience and psyche. Some rulers became obsessed with omens and astrology, seeking guidance from soothsayers and alchemists in an attempt to foresee threats before they struck. Others became prisoners of their own rituals and compulsions, trapped in cycles of behavior that appeared irrational but were, in their minds, protective. Beyond personal fear, mental instability had political consequences. A king's madness could spark civil war, embolden enemies, and ignite power struggles within the court. Charles VI's illness left France vulnerable to the ambitions of dukes and foreign powers, culminating in the catastrophic events of the 100 Years' War. In England, King George III's later struggles with mental health, though centuries later, offer a parallel. The monarch's mind could destabilize not only the palace, but the nation itself. Yet there was a grim method to this madness. Many kings learned to wield their instability as a tool. Displays of rage, erratic behavior, and unpredictable decrees kept nobles and subjects alike off balance, ensuring obedience through fear. Madness was a weapon as much as a curse, one that could protect a throne even as it eroded the mind of its holder. And so the crown of madness was both literal and metaphorical. It weighed on the skull of the king, pressing down with invisible but crushing force, distorting perception and warping judgment. Those who wore it were trapped between brilliance and insanity, capable of acts of genius, cruelty, or profound moral blindness. Isolation, responsibility, and constant threat created a world in which sanity was fragile, and the distinction between ruler and prisoner often disappeared entirely. In understanding the crown of madness, we begin to grasp a central truth about medieval kingship. Absolute power was never truly liberating. It demanded vigilance, cunning, and ruthlessness, but it also exacted a psychological toll that few could endure without breaking. For every kingdom ruled by strategy and wisdom, there was another ruled by delusion and fear, a kingdom in which the monarch's mind was as much a battlefield as the lands they claimed to control. The disturbing lives of kings were defined not only by the external threats they faced, but by the internal ones they could never escape. Paranoia, obsession, and madness were as real and dangerous as any army or rebellion, shaping history in ways both subtle and catastrophic. And yet, even in the grip of these psychological horrors, kings continued to wield absolute power, proving that behind every crown lies a mind teetering on the edge of brilliance and destruction. Court of Shadows. If the crown weighed heavily on the mind, the court was a labyrinth of danger that never let the king rest. Medieval royal courts were not simply places of splendor, feasts, and ceremonial displays. They were theaters of manipulation, betrayal, and constant surveillance. Every smile, every bow, every whispered word could conceal ambition, resentment, or outright treachery. For a king, the court was both a stage and a trap, a place where power was displayed and simultaneously threatened at every turn. To live in a court was to live in a world of perpetual performance. Kings were expected to project authority, charm, and wisdom at all times, but behind the facade, fear and suspicion simmered. Courtiers learned early that proximity to the king could mean influence or death. Advisors, nobles, and servants constantly jockeyed for favor. Alliances shifted like sand, and every interaction carried the potential for peril. No one could be trusted completely. Even a loyal minister might one day see opportunity in a moment of weakness. Spies and informants were the court's lifeblood. Kings employed secret networks of agents who observed the behavior of courtiers, reporting on the smallest signs of disloyalty. A misstep in etiquette, a poorly chosen word, or a glance interpreted as disrespect could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution. For the king, these reports were both protection and torment. Every day brought new evidence of potential betrayal, and every night brought sleepless anxiety over imagined conspiracies. Paranoia was not merely a psychological affliction. In the court, it was a survival skill. The architecture of fear extended to entertainment and ceremony as well. Banquets, tournaments, and festivals were not just displays of wealth, they were arenas in which loyalty could be tested, alliances could be reinforced, and rivals could be humiliated. Kings observed their subjects closely, noting who flinched at a jest, who laughed too freely, and who lingered too long near a noble of higher rank. Even the arrangement of seating at a feast could signal power, and the wrong gesture might ignite a deadly feud. Yet the court was not entirely ruled by fear alone. Manipulation, charm, and flattery were equally potent tools. Kings learned to reward obedience and punish defiance with theatrical precision. Advisors who mastered the art of subtlety could survive and thrive, while those who overstepped, even unintentionally, risked a swift and brutal fall. Consider the court of Henry VIII, where ministers who failed to anticipate the king's moods often faced beheading. Loyalty was not enough. The ability to read the king's unstable mind was essential for survival. Sexual politics were also a deadly game within these walls. Royal mistresses, consorts, and even queens wielded influence behind the scenes, sometimes orchestrating intrigues that reshaped the kingdom. Relationships were rarely based on affection alone. They were political tools, bargaining chips, and potential weapons. Kings were both predators and prey in these interactions, drawn into webs of desire and manipulation that could determine their fortunes or hasten their downfall. The danger extended to family, too. Siblings, cousins, and even children were potential rivals. Fratricide and patricide were not unheard of when ambition clashed with succession. Richard III of England, for example, allegedly orchestrated the disappearance of his nephews to secure his throne, a grim reminder that the court was never a safe haven, even from one's own blood. For kings, the very people they were meant to trust most often posed the greatest threat. The psychological toll of living in such a court cannot be overstated. Kings were constantly balancing power, fear, loyalty, and ambition. Every decision, no matter how small, carried consequences that could ripple through the palace and the kingdom. Sleep was interrupted by anxiety, meals were eaten amid suspicion, and even moments of leisure were tainted by the knowledge that danger lurked behind every gesture. In many cases, the king's mental health deteriorated under this relentless pressure, feeding a vicious cycle of paranoia, cruelty, and isolation. Yet there was an undeniable magnetism to the court as well. The opportunity to influence a kingdom, shape history, and bask in proximity to absolute power drew ambitious men and women into its orbit. But for those who failed to navigate the shadows correctly, the consequences were often fatal. Life in the court was a constant game of chess, where every piece could move against the king, and every ally could become an enemy. In the court of shadows, a king was never truly alone, yet never truly safe. Power and danger were inseparable companions, feeding into each other in an endless cycle of suspicion, manipulation, and fear. Here, in these stone corridors lined with tapestries and echoes of whispered plots, the disturbing realities of kingship came alive. Every day was a performance, every gesture a test, and every night a reminder that in the court nothing was as it seemed, and no one could be trusted. Feasts and follies. When we picture medieval kings, it's easy to imagine them seated on grand thrones, surrounded by wealth and splendor, presiding over magnificent banquets. But behind the veneer of opulence lay a world steeped in excess, indulgence, and often disturbing eccentricities. For many monarchs, feasting was not merely sustenance. It was a stage for power, a tool of control, and, in some cases, a mirror of their mental and moral decay. Royal feasts were grand affairs, designed to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and showcase the wealth and influence of the crown. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pies, exotic fruits, and imported delicacies that the common people would never taste. Yet these feasts were about more than just food. They were spectacles, with music, dancing, jesters, and elaborate rituals woven into every course. Attendance was mandatory for nobles, and every action at the table, how one ate, where one sat, how one responded to the king's whims, was scrutinized. A misplaced glance or a slow response could invite suspicion or even punishment. Excess, however, often became grotesque. Many kings indulged in gluttony to the point of self-harm. The sheer quantity of food consumed during these feasts could lead to illness, obesity, and long-term health problems, yet the appetite for luxury never waned. Edward II of England reportedly preferred lavish meals to matters of state, while other rulers maintained diets so extravagant they symbolized both power and moral decay. In this sense, feasts were a reflection of the king himself, grand, imposing, yet dangerously indulgent. Beyond gluttony, entertainment at these feasts could be deeply disturbing. Jesters and performers were often instructed to mock, humiliate, or provoke court members for the amusement of the king. Kings took pleasure in games that were cruel and sadistic, contests of endurance, public shaming, and even staged punishments. Ludwig II of Bavaria, though later than the medieval period, exemplified a disturbing obsession with spectacle. And similar tendencies existed among medieval rulers, an obsession with seeing human behavior twisted for amusement or spectacle. These entertainments blurred the line between amusement and cruelty, revealing how power and excess could corrupt moral judgment. Alcohol flowed freely at court, amplifying both revelry and disorder. Kings often used banquets as tools to assert dominance over nobles and foreign emissaries, watching their intoxicated behavior to gauge loyalty, temper, and ambition. A toast could be a subtle threat, a demand, or a test. Drunken courtiers who misjudged their words could find themselves exiled, imprisoned, or worse. In these moments, feasts became instruments of control, where indulgence and terror intertwined seamlessly. Yet there was a psychological dimension to these displays. For kings consumed by paranoia, feasts were a form of reassurance, a way to observe potential threats under the guise of celebration. Every bite, every laugh, every gesture was watched, evaluated, and remembered. The banquet hall was not merely a room of pleasure. It was a theater of surveillance and judgment. Courtiers learned quickly that favor was given sparingly and could be revoked at a moment's notice. The king's pleasure dictated life at court, and displeasure could be lethal. Feasts also served to display the king's control over the natural world and global trade. Exotic spices, rare wines, and foreign delicacies signaled wealth and dominance. Yet this obsession with rarity often bordered on compulsion. Kings became collectors of the unusual, whether it was animals, artwork, or bizarre curiosities, sometimes to the point of obsession. These collections were more than decoration. They were manifestations of the king's desire to assert power over every aspect of existence, a symbolic extension of the crown itself. Even indulgence in women, in some courts, became entwined with spectacle. Royal mistresses, dancers, and entertainers were presented as part of the visual and sensual experience of the feast. These arrangements reinforced hierarchy, dominance, and control, and sometimes veered into exploitation or cruelty. Pleasure was intertwined with power. Indulgence became a mechanism for demonstrating who was truly sovereign. Through feasts, we see a reflection of the medieval king's mind, indulgent, obsessive, and often cruel. The banquet hall was not just a place for nourishment, but a crucible of power, paranoia, and perverse enjoyment. These rituals, so meticulously staged and socially charged, reveal how deeply the desire for control and spectacle ran through the lives of kings. Gluttony, cruelty, and obsession were not merely personal failings, they were the very tools by which rulers maintained their authority, projecting both majesty and terror in equal measure. In the shadow of these lavish feasts, the disturbing reality emerges. Kings were consumed by excess, not merely for pleasure, but as a means to assert dominance, manipulate perception, and satisfy psychological needs born of paranoia, isolation, and unyielding power. Behind the gilded dishes and flowing wine lay a mind as complex, dark, and disturbed as the kingdom it ruled. The weight of suspicion. For a medieval king, trust was a dangerous luxury. Every glance, every whisper, every act of loyalty could be scrutinized, doubted, or weaponized. In a world where power was both absolute and precarious, suspicion became the foundation of rule. Kings were expected to govern with wisdom, justice, and strength, yet paranoia often dictated their decisions, leaving a trail of fear, betrayal, and death in its wake. The weight of suspicion was not simply a mental burden, it was a tool, a weapon, and in many cases, a curse that defined the very essence of kingship. Many monarchs allowed even the smallest slights or imagined disloyalties to fester into deadly consequences. Henry VIII of England, notorious for his paranoia and ruthlessness, exemplifies this terrifying tendency. Obsessed with loyalty, he executed wives, advisors, and nobles at the slightest hint of betrayal. Anne Boleyn, once queen, fell victim to a web of accusations, largely fabricated or exaggerated, ultimately losing her life to the king's obsession with control. In Henry's court, suspicion was inseparable from power. To doubt the king was to risk life and limb. Paranoia extended beyond courtly intrigue into the very structures of governance. Kings often surrounded themselves with loyalists, spies, and enforcers, whose primary duty was to uncover treachery. Reports of conspiracies, real or imagined, were treated with grave seriousness. Some monarchs, like Charles VI of France, became convinced that entire factions plotted against them, resulting in purges of advisors, friends, and family members. These purges were often indiscriminate, driven by delusion, fear, or a desire to demonstrate power. The result was a court filled with tension, fear, and constant vigilance, a place where no one felt safe, and everyone knew that loyalty could be fleeting. The psychological toll of such suspicion was immense. Kings lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, analyzing every gesture, phrase, and expression for signs of betrayal. Sleep was elusive, as nightmares of conspiracies and assassinations haunted the mind. Daily life became a series of tests, manipulations, and rehearsals of power. Every interaction could conceal hidden threats, and every decision carried the risk of catastrophic consequences. This environment of fear created rulers who were often cruel, erratic, and consumed by obsession, perpetuating a cycle in which paranoia fed tyranny, and tyranny reinforced paranoia. Execution and torture were tools that amplified the power of suspicion. Medieval kings did not merely punish traitors, they often made examples of them, transforming fear into a weapon of governance. Hanging, beheading, drawing, and quartering, and other brutal punishments were both deterrent and spectacle. The king's authority was demonstrated not through justice alone, but through terror. Public executions reinforced loyalty, while ensuring that even the hint of defiance could be deadly. In many cases, the fear of punishment became more influential than affection or allegiance, shaping behavior and cementing the king's dominance. The weight of suspicion also poisoned familial relationships. Brothers, sons, and cousins, those who shared blood, were not exempt from scrutiny. Succession was a perilous matter, and many kings preemptively eliminated perceived threats within their own families to secure the throne. Richard III of England allegedly orchestrated the disappearance of his nephews to consolidate power, while Edward II faced rebellion from his own barons, fueled in part by suspicion and distrust. In such an environment, loyalty was rarely innate. It was conditional, fragile, and constantly tested. Even decisions unrelated to politics were tainted by paranoia. Alliances, marriages, and negotiations were approached with caution, suspicion, and calculation. Kings became obsessed with foreseeing threats, controlling variables, and neutralizing potential risks. This preoccupation often led to extreme behavior, from imprisoning perceived rivals to orchestrating entire conspiracies to root out imagined enemies. The line between real and imagined betrayal blurred, and in many cases, the king's own mind became the most dangerous battlefield of all. Yet, suspicion was not entirely destructive. For some rulers, it became a tool of survival, enabling them to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life. The ability to anticipate disloyalty, interpret hidden motives, and act decisively could preserve a throne and prevent chaos. But it came at a price: isolation, cruelty, and an unrelenting fear that no one, not even the closest confidants, could ever be fully trusted. In the end, the weight of suspicion defined the disturbing lives of medieval kings. Power was inseparable from fear, loyalty was inseparable from terror, and paranoia was inseparable from survival. The crown demanded constant vigilance, and every shadow could conceal a threat. For those who wore it, life was a relentless exercise in mistrust, manipulation, and control, a reality far darker than any tale of medieval glory or chivalry. Pleasure and pain. Medieval kings lived lives that balanced on a knife edge between indulgence and cruelty. Power afforded them unimaginable privileges, yet those privileges often manifested in disturbing habits and obsessions. Pleasure, for these rulers, was rarely simple or innocent. It was intertwined with authority, manipulation, and, at times, sadistic enjoyment. Pain, too, was a constant companion, either inflicted upon others as a demonstration of dominance or endured as a reflection of their own psychological torment. For many monarchs, the line between enjoyment and cruelty blurred, revealing a mind consumed by desire, fear, and power. Sexuality was one of the most complex and perilous arenas of pleasure for medieval kings. Marriage was seldom a matter of affection. It was political, a tool to secure alliances, produce heirs, and consolidate power. Yet behind closed doors, kings often pursued relationships that flouted convention, morality, or law. Mistresses were commonplace, and many rulers engaged in sexual liaisons that were as strategic as they were personal. But for some kings, desire became obsessive, even dangerous. Henry VIII, driven by his pursuit of a male heir, executed 2 of his wives and others in his court, merging obsession with cruelty in ways that would terrify any contemporary observer. Sexual pleasure was not always private. In certain courts, it became a public instrument of control, a spectacle to remind subjects and nobles alike of the king's power. Courtiers could be rewarded or punished based on their participation, compliance, or failure to navigate the delicate web of desire and politics. In this environment, intimacy was rarely a matter of love. It was leverage, a reflection of hierarchy, and a mechanism for enforcing loyalty. Pleasure was inseparable from power, and desire could easily tip into cruelty. Beyond sexual obsession, many kings found entertainment in acts that modern sensibilities would deem perverse or sadistic. Games, competitions, and punishments were often orchestrated to satisfy a taste for dominance and spectacle. Nobles, servants, or even animals could be manipulated to demonstrate the ruler's absolute control. Some kings staged cruel amusements simply to observe human suffering, testing the limits of endurance, loyalty, or obedience. These acts reflected a disturbing truth. The monarch's mind, shaped by paranoia, isolation, and absolute power, could transform curiosity and pleasure into instruments of fear. Pain was also personal, often the result of mental anguish and psychological strain. Many kings were prisoners of their own obsessions, tormented by fear, guilt, or delusions. Charles VI of France, convinced he was made of glass, isolated himself to avoid shattering, while other rulers experienced violent mood swings, hallucinations, or melancholia. The burden of kingship, the weight of responsibility, constant threats, and the necessity of controlling a kingdom through fear could amplify latent mental disorders, making the king both a source of terror and a tragic figure. Pleasure and pain, indulgence and fear, were inseparable in the life of a medieval ruler. Even the pursuit of art, architecture, and luxury reflected this duality. Extravagant palaces, elaborate clothing, and exquisite objects satisfied the king's aesthetic desires, but were also instruments of control and psychological reassurance. Lavish surroundings projected authority, distracted from paranoia, and reinforced a sense of mastery over both people and environment. Yet obsession with such material perfection could verge on compulsion, revealing a mind both brilliant and fragile. A king's enjoyment of beauty and craftsmanship was often shadowed by fear. Fear that rivals would seize his wealth, spies would expose his secrets, or failure to maintain appearances would undermine his power. Pleasure and pain also intertwined in the daily governance of the realm. Executions, punishments, and judicial spectacles were as much about psychological control as law or morality. Kings who derived satisfaction from these acts often did so in ways that blurred the line between necessary authority and personal amusement. Torture devices, public executions, and humiliations served to instill fear while simultaneously gratifying the ruler's darker impulses. These rituals reinforced social hierarchy, but they also reflected a disturbing intimacy with cruelty that defined the psychology of many monarchs. In the end, the lives of medieval kings were governed by this duality: the pursuit of pleasure inseparable from displays of power and cruelty, and the experience of pain intertwined with paranoia and obsession. Every indulgence, every amusement, and every desire was influenced by the crown they bore. What might appear as decadence or eccentricity from a distance was, in truth, a manifestation of fear, control, and psychological strain. In the palace, pleasure and pain were two sides of the same coin, and the monarch, for all his majesty, was both the wielder and the victim of their terrifying interplay. The throne of blood. The crown, heavy as it was, carried more than the weight of authority. It bore the stain of blood. Medieval kings did not simply inherit lands, wealth, or subjects. They inherited a world of violence, treachery, and death. For these rulers, the throne was never a symbol of peace or stability. It was a constant reminder that power was secured, maintained, and expanded through brutality. Wars, assassinations, and political plots were not exceptions. They were the everyday tools of survival in a world where suspicion and ambition intertwined with mortal danger. For many kings, warfare was both a necessity and a reflection of personal temperament. From the earliest age, princes were trained in combat, strategy, and siegecraft, preparing them for a lifetime of military engagement. Yet the personal stakes were often far higher than mere national security. Battles were as much about eliminating rivals, consolidating power, and demonstrating dominance as they were about defending borders. A king's reputation could be shattered or solidified on the field of war. Victories enhanced authority, defeats exposed vulnerability, inviting rebellion, intrigue, or assassination. The political landscape of medieval Europe was a chessboard riddled with threats. Nobles, neighboring monarchs, and even family members could challenge the throne at any moment. Plots were constant, and the line between ally and adversary was perilously thin. Richard III's alleged involvement in the disappearance of his nephews underscores the deadly intersection of personal ambition and political survival. Similarly, Edward II's downfall was fueled not just by battlefield failures, but by courtly conspiracies and familial betrayal. Kings who failed to navigate these treacherous waters often met violent ends, a grim reminder that the throne was as much a trap as it was a prize. Assassinations, both attempted and successful, were a pervasive reality. Poisoning, ambush, and murder in bed were tools employed by rivals seeking to claim power. Kings, aware of these dangers, developed habits and rituals aimed at self-preservation. Some ate only food prepared by trusted cooks, others slept with armed guards nearby, and many surrounded themselves with spies to monitor the loyalty of everyone in proximity. Yet no precaution could entirely eliminate risk. Even the most vigilant monarch could fall victim to betrayal, often by those closest to them. The intersection of personal paranoia and political necessity created an environment where cruelty was both strategic and personal. Kings frequently ordered executions to remove potential rivals or intimidate dissenters, blending public spectacle with private vengeance. Hanging, beheading, and more gruesome methods served dual purposes, eliminating threats and sending a vivid message about the cost of disloyalty. For the king, bloodshed was not merely an administrative tool. It was a psychological necessity, a way to assert control and manage fear in a world defined by uncertainty. Even alliances were fragile, subject to the constant threat of betrayal. Marriages were arranged and dissolved to secure political advantage, often leaving the individuals involved in danger. Kings used diplomacy as a weapon, turning friends into enemies, and enemies into temporary allies, only to discard them when expedient. In this sense, the throne was a seat of endless negotiation, manipulation, and calculated violence, where every decision carried mortal consequences. The personal cost of ruling in this environment was immense. Paranoia, fear, and moral compromise shaped not only the king's behavior but also his mental state. Many rulers became obsessed with security, surrounding themselves with ever-shifting networks of loyalists and spies. Mental health deteriorated under the relentless pressure of constant threat, with delusions, fits of rage, and compulsive behaviors emerging as natural consequences of an existence where danger was omnipresent. A throne stained with blood was often matched by a mind scarred by fear. Yet, bloodshed also reinforced the monarchy. By demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty, kings maintained authority over nobles, subjects, and rivals. Violence became a language of power, one that communicated more effectively than words or treaties ever could. It was a terrifying but necessary aspect of governance, in a world where the crown could be lost in a single night of betrayal. In the end, the throne of blood was both a literal and symbolic reality. The life of a medieval king was inseparable from death, betrayal, and violence. Wars were fought, plots hatched, and executions carried out not merely as political maneuvers, but as expressions of the fragile, paranoid, and often ruthless psyche that occupied the crown. The throne was both a seat of power and a chamber of horrors, a place where survival demanded brutality, and where the blood of others and sometimes one's own was the price of rule. Haunted by the past, for many medieval kings, the crown was less a symbol of triumph than a chain that bound them to a lifetime of trauma, betrayal, and unhealed wounds. The throne was not merely inherited, it was a continuation of every fear, every scar, and every loss that preceded it. Childhood abuse, familial betrayal, battlefield horrors, and personal failures all cast long shadows over their reigns. To rule, they carried not only the weight of kingdoms, but the invisible burden of past horrors that shaped their minds, decisions, and, ultimately, their legacies. Royal upbringing itself was often traumatic. Princes grew up witnessing cruelty on a daily basis, executions of rivals, punishments of servants, and betrayals among nobles. Such experiences were considered necessary for survival and instruction, yet they often left deep psychological scars. Young monarchs learned that life was fragile, trust was dangerous, and power was inseparable from fear. Some internalized this trauma in ways that affected their decisions for decades. Others became obsessed with control, seeking to manipulate every aspect of their surroundings to prevent history from repeating itself. Family relationships could be equally destructive. The royal bloodline, meant to be a source of legitimacy, often became a source of danger. Siblings, cousins, and even children could threaten succession, and ambition frequently turned blood into a weapon. Edward II's troubled relationships with his barons and nobles, coupled with favoritism toward companions perceived as outsiders, created a toxic mix of resentment and political instability. Betrayal was personal. Every act of rebellion or intrigue reinforced the lesson that no one, even family, could be trusted. Kings were haunted by those who should have been allies, and many developed lifelong suspicions and anxieties as a result. Trauma extended beyond family and court life into the battlefield. Wars were omnipresent in medieval Europe, and kings were expected to lead from the front. The horrors of combat, mass death, maiming, and betrayal by allies left lasting impressions. Some rulers, like Edward III of England, faced the dual responsibility of commanding armies while navigating complex political alliances, making every decision a matter of life and death. The weight of these experiences often manifested in obsessive planning, hypervigilance, and, in extreme cases, mental instability. Past failures haunted kings, shaping both their strategies and their insecurities. Even victories could carry a dark legacy. Success in war or politics often depended on ruthless decisions that left bodies and minds in their wake. Kings who triumphed by eliminating rivals, orchestrating purges, or manipulating allies were forced to reconcile their achievements with the human cost. This duality, glory intertwined with guilt, left many rulers in a state of psychological conflict, haunted by deeds they could neither undo nor fully justify. For some, the past became a lens through which every current action was filtered, producing paranoia, cruelty, and obsession. Mental health challenges were often exacerbated by the relentless reminders of past traumas. Kings who witnessed betrayal, violence, or personal loss could develop chronic anxiety, obsessive tendencies, or even psychosis. Charles VI of France, haunted by a lifetime of familial and political turmoil, descended into madness that destabilized the realm. Henry VIII's fear of disloyalty and obsession with heirs can also be traced back to his upbringing and early exposure to court intrigue. Trauma, once seated, influenced their governance, decisions, and interactions for years, if not decades. Haunted pasts also shaped personal relationships. Marriages were political contracts, alliances were fragile, and friendships were constantly tested. Kings who had been betrayed or abandoned learned to manipulate, control, or dominate others to prevent further harm. Emotional intimacy was rare. Suspicion became instinct. Many rulers projected their fears onto their subjects, advisors, and family, using suspicion and cruelty as shields against repeating historical wounds. In this way, the ghosts of the past dictated the rhythm of court life, shaping behavior in subtle and often devastating ways. Even in moments of apparent power, kings were prisoners of memory. Each betrayal, each failure, each battlefield loss lingered like a specter, influencing decisions, amplifying paranoia, and guiding strategies. The throne may have promised authority, but it offered no escape from the psychological shadows cast by past experiences. These invisible chains often drove rulers to extremes: overreaction, violence, or obsession, making their reigns as dangerous for themselves as for those they ruled. In the lives of medieval kings, the past was never past. It was a living, breathing force, shaping the mind, behavior, and decisions of those who wore the crown. Trauma was inseparable from power. Memory was inseparable from paranoia. To understand the disturbing lives of these rulers, one must see the throne not merely as a seat of authority, but as a stage haunted by the ghosts of every betrayal, every war, and every loss that came before. Their decisions, obsessions, and cruelties were echoes of what they had endured, and in many ways, they were prisoners of a history they could neither escape nor rewrite. Obsession with legacy. For many medieval kings, the crown was not only a symbol of power, it was a reminder of mortality. Ruling a kingdom came with an acute awareness that life was fleeting, that rebellion could come at any moment, and that death would eventually claim even the mightiest monarch. For some, this fear manifested as an overwhelming obsession with legacy, the desperate desire to be remembered, revered, and immortalized long after their bodies had returned to dust. In the lives of these kings, legacy was both a preoccupation and a compulsion, shaping art, architecture, law, and even cruelty. From the earliest days of their reign, rulers considered how their actions would echo through history. Battles were not merely fought for territorial gain, they were fought for renown, for the prestige that would ensure their names lived on. Triumphs in war, the conquest of rivals, and decisive victories were meticulously recorded and broadcast, designed to cement a reputation for power, wisdom, or divine favor. Yet the pursuit of immortality was rarely clean or noble. It often carried a trail of blood, fear, and destruction. Kings understood that the monuments of memory required both adoration and terror. Architecture was one of the primary instruments of legacy. Castles, cathedrals, and fortifications were built not just for defense or function, but to reflect the majesty of the monarch and their dynasty. Louis IX of France commissioned grand projects that showcased religious devotion and royal authority, while other kings obsessively renovated palaces and halls to impress courtiers and foreign dignitaries. Every spire, gate, and decorative detail was an extension of the king's desire to leave a mark on the world, a testament to his grandeur and control. These monuments were simultaneously statements of power and efforts to outlast mortality, evidence that a king's influence could transcend death. Art and literature also became tools in the pursuit of legacy. Kings commissioned chroniclers, painters, and sculptors to immortalize their reigns, often portraying themselves as wise, just, or divinely favored. Portraits, tapestries, and epic poems presented curated versions of their lives, designed to shape history according to their vision. Some monarchs even manipulated historical records, erasing inconvenient truths and exaggerating accomplishments to ensure that their version of reality endured. In this way, obsession with legacy extended beyond physical monuments. It reached into the very narrative of history, molding perception for generations. The obsession with legacy could also manifest in more personal and darker ways. Kings often demanded that their deeds, rewards, and punishments be remembered, using terror as a means of eternal influence. Public executions, purges, and displays of dominance were not only tools of control in the moment, they were calculated performances to leave lasting impressions. A noble who witnessed the beheading of a traitor would carry that memory for life, a reminder of the king's reach, authority, and ruthlessness. In these acts, cruelty became a component of immortality. The king's fearsome reputation ensured that his name would endure, even in terror. Legacy was intertwined with succession and heirs. Producing a child to carry on the dynasty was often considered the ultimate means of achieving immortality. Kings obsessed over heirs, arranging marriages, controlling courtly relationships, and eliminating rivals to secure the lineage. Failure to produce an heir was a source of profound anxiety, sometimes driving monarchs to extremes of cruelty, political maneuvering, and personal obsession. In this sense, legacy was inseparable from family, succession, and the future of the crown. Even rituals and religion played into this preoccupation. Kings sought divine approval for their actions, believing that their immortalization required heavenly sanction. Churches, chapels, and endowments were commissioned to reflect piety, justify authority, and secure spiritual remembrance. Legacy, therefore, was both earthly and divine, blending political ambition with spiritual ambition in a powerful but psychologically consuming mix. In the end, obsession with legacy shaped not only the king's reign, but his entire existence. It drove ambition, fueled paranoia, and justified acts of both brilliance and cruelty. Every castle, every battle, every recorded deed was motivated by the need to endure beyond mortality. For medieval kings, life was transient, but their obsession ensured that their influence, memory, and power would remain alive in the minds of subjects, chroniclers, and history itself. Yet, this obsession came at a cost. It demanded constant vigilance, manipulation, and control, revealing a ruler who was never at peace, always haunted by the fear that the world might forget him. In their relentless pursuit of immortality, medieval kings left a legacy as much of terror and obsession as of glory. Their lives were marked by the delicate balance between human frailty and the desire to be remembered, as more than mortal, a desire that shaped history and illuminated the disturbing psychology behind the crown. The madness of power. Absolute power, the medieval kings soon discovered, was not merely a blessing, it was a crucible. The crown granted dominion over land, subjects, and resources, yet it also demanded omniscience, constant vigilance, and unflinching authority. Few rulers were equipped to endure such pressure without their minds bending, fracturing, or snapping entirely. The throne amplified fears, obsessions, and paranoia, creating a unique brand of madness born not just from personal temperament, but from the relentless demands of absolute authority. For many kings, madness was both a personal and political phenomenon. Rulers like Charles VI of France, Henry VIII of England, and Ivan IV of Russia demonstrated how power could warp the mind, turning brilliance into tyranny. The king's decisions were no longer guided solely by strategy or morality. They were filtered through a lens of suspicion, obsession, and fear. Every action, from taxation to execution, became a reflection of the ruler's mental state, illustrating how intertwined governance and psychological strain could be. The roots of this madness were varied. Isolation was one of the most potent factors. Kings lived behind walls of stone and loyalty, surrounded by advisors whose intentions were perpetually suspect. Paranoia became both a shield and a trap. The king distrusted everyone but could not survive without their counsel. The psychological toll of constant surveillance, of needing to know, anticipate, and manipulate every action in court and kingdom, was immense. Sleep was often scarce, and moments of solitude became dangerous incubators for obsession. Fear of betrayal intensified this mental strain. Medieval courts were rife with intrigue, assassination plots, and shifting alliances. For the king, every gesture and word could hide deception. Henry VIII's later years exemplified the destructive effect of this environment. His obsessive quest to secure loyalty and heirs led to the execution of wives, ministers, and nobles alike, each act reinforcing his sense of vulnerability even as it solidified authority. Paranoia and cruelty fed each other in a vicious cycle, illustrating the symbiotic relationship between power and madness. Beyond paranoia, many kings exhibited erratic and compulsive behaviors. Charles VI famously wandered the halls of his palace in states of delusion, believing he was made of glass or that invisible enemies threatened his life. Ivan the Terrible of Russia oscillated between acts of extraordinary strategy and extreme brutality, ordering mass executions and purges that left his realm in terror. These patterns reveal how absolute authority magnified existing psychological tendencies, turning personal insecurities into instruments of political consequence. Madness also manifested in obsessions with control and ritual. Kings demanded perfection in their environment, from palace architecture to ceremonial protocol. Slight deviations, whether in dress, conduct, or ceremony, could provoke violent reactions. These rituals, while appearing as idiosyncrasy, were often attempts to impose order on a chaotic and threatening world. Obsessive attention to detail became a coping mechanism, a way to control a reality that, by nature of kingship, was unpredictable and fraught with danger. The consequences of this madness extended beyond the personal. Entire kingdoms could suffer from the erratic decisions of an unstable monarch. Wars were declared impulsively, alliances dissolved without reason, and punishments meted out with caprice. Subjects and nobles alike lived under constant fear, never certain if the ruler's actions reflected justice, strategy, or delusion. The crown, intended as a symbol of order, could become a source of instability and terror. Yet, paradoxically, madness could also reinforce authority. Erratic behavior, unpredictable punishments, and displays of cruelty kept subjects and courtiers off balance, ensuring obedience through fear. A king who appeared unstable was simultaneously vulnerable and omnipotent, a figure whose power was magnified by the uncertainty he inspired. In this sense, the line between madness and strategy was often indistinguishable, making psychological instability both a liability and a tool. In the end, the madness of power demonstrates the brutal reality of medieval kingship. Absolute authority magnified human frailty, transforming paranoia, obsession, and fear into political instruments. The throne was not merely a seat of governance, but a psychological crucible, exposing the vulnerabilities of those who wore the crown. Rulers could shape empires or destroy them, all while battling the internal demons that absolute power inevitably conjured. Medieval kings were more than rulers. They were men trapped in a relentless cycle of fear, obsession, and authority, their minds as much a battlefield as their kingdoms. The crown promised dominion, but it demanded a toll few could survive without losing touch with reason, morality, or humanity itself. In understanding the madness of power, we glimpse the disturbing intersection of mind, monarchy, and the unyielding weight of ruling with absolute authority, the specter of death. For a medieval king, death was never a distant inevitability. It was a constant presence, stalking the throne with quiet persistence. Assassination plots, battlefield hazards, disease, and even seemingly minor accidents reminded rulers daily that the crown could be claimed at any moment by fortune or foe. living in the shadow of mortality, was a defining aspect of kingship, shaping behavior, paranoia, and the often brutal methods used to secure survival. The specter of death haunted every decision, every alliance, and every step the king took within his palace walls and beyond. Assassination was perhaps the most intimate and terrifying reminder of mortality. Unlike battles, which offered some measure of preparation, assassination could strike anywhere, often orchestrated by those closest to the king. Poison was a favored weapon, subtle and insidious, capable of eliminating a monarch without public spectacle. Blades, ambushes, and staged accidents were equally common, turning everyday life into a minefield of potential death. Henry IV of England narrowly survived multiple assassination attempts, each one reinforcing the pervasive anxiety that no amount of power could fully protect him. Even within the palace, kings were never truly safe. Trusted advisors, relatives, and courtiers could easily turn traitors, driven by ambition, fear, or desperation. The constant need to identify enemies created an environment of hypervigilance, where every word, glance, and action was analyzed for hidden meaning. Guards, spies, and secret chambers became essential tools for survival. But they could only mitigate risk. They could not eliminate it. Death was never far away, lurking in shadows that the king might never fully illuminate. Disease, too, was a relentless threat. Epidemics, infections, and even minor injuries could prove fatal in a time without modern medicine. Kings were constantly reminded of human fragility, no matter how many riches or armies they commanded. Some rulers, like Charles V of France, struggled with illnesses that limited their ability to govern, feeding anxiety and a sense of vulnerability. The awareness of bodily frailty heightened paranoia and contributed to compulsive behaviors designed to preserve life, reputation, and authority. War compounded these fears. Battles, sieges, and rebellions were inherently deadly, and kings often led troops directly, exposing themselves to enemy blades. Yet even in command, survival was uncertain. Battlefield strategy could not guarantee safety from betrayal or chance. Richard III's military campaigns, for example, were as much about consolidating power as defending territory. But each engagement carried the implicit reminder that one misstep could end his reign and life. Kings lived with the constant knowledge that death could arrive not only through combat, but through the ambitions of those who sought to replace them. The specter of death also influenced the psychological state of kings. Many became obsessed with control, security, and the elimination of threats, extending suspicion to friends, family, and allies. This obsession often manifested in cruelty. Executions, tortures, and purges became routine, both as a deterrent and as reassurance that the king remained untouchable. In a world where assassination and rebellion were perpetual risks, fear became both a tool and a companion, shaping the very personality of the monarch. Religion and superstition played roles as well. Kings frequently turned to priests, astrologers, and soothsayers to anticipate danger and prolong life. Rituals, charms, and omens were taken seriously, guiding military decisions, political alliances, and daily behavior. This reliance on spiritual and mystical guidance reflected both genuine belief and a desperate attempt to exert control over the uncontrollable, a recognition that death, despite all earthly power, remained the ultimate arbiter. Even leisure was shadowed by mortality. Feasts, hunting, and entertainment carried risks and often became arenas to test loyalty and assert dominance, ensuring that the king remained vigilant even in moments of apparent pleasure. Paranoia and fear were constant companions, shaping behavior, mood, and decisions in ways both subtle and profound. Life was never simply lived, it was managed, calculated, and fortified against the inevitable approach of death. In the end, the specter of death defined medieval kingship. The crown offered power and authority, yet it came with a relentless reminder that life was fragile, loyalty was fleeting, and survival was never guaranteed. Fear of assassination, disease, rebellion, and fate shaped not only policy but psychology, producing rulers who were as cautious and ruthless as they were brilliant. To wear the crown was to live in constant awareness that death could claim the throne at any moment, and this awareness cast a shadow over every decision, every alliance, and every act of power. For medieval kings, death was more than an end. It was a presence that dictated thought, behavior, and the disturbing intersection of fear, authority, and cruelty that defined their reigns. The crown protected, empowered, and isolated its wearer. But it could never protect against the ultimate certainty that awaited every human being. The final inescapable specter of death, secrets, and scandals. Beneath the glittering facade of medieval courts lay a hidden world of secrets, indulgences, and scandals that could destroy reputations or entire dynasties. Kings, though outwardly omnipotent, were constantly entangled in webs of private intrigues, sexual misconduct, and morally dubious behavior. These hidden lives were often as disturbing as the public displays of power and cruelty, revealing rulers whose desires, obsessions, and indiscretions could be weaponized by enemies or exposed for shock and humiliation. In a court built on appearance, secrecy was both survival and vulnerability. Sexual misconduct was a persistent source of scandal. Monarchs, possessing absolute authority, frequently engaged in affairs, adultery, or exploitative relationships with courtiers and servants. Mistresses were not merely companions, they were instruments of influence, political leverage, and, in some cases, scandalous amusement. Kings like Henry VIII navigated marriages and affairs with deadly consequence, eliminating those who threatened the production of heirs or who displeased him in personal or political ways. Mistresses could elevate families, provoke feuds, and even trigger executions, illustrating how private desire could intersect with public danger. Courtiers themselves were never entirely innocent in the creation of scandals. Gossip, jealousy, and manipulation thrived in the enclosed environment of the palace. A whispered rumor could reach the king's ears and result in exile, imprisonment, or execution, making secrecy an essential survival tactic. Advisors, relatives, and servants learned to conceal indiscretions and ambitions alike, yet the smallest lapse in discretion could spark a scandal that reverberated throughout the kingdom. The king's awareness of this constant surveillance only intensified paranoia and obsession, as every secret threatened to undermine authority. Religious and moral expectations amplified the danger of scandal. Kings were expected to be pious and virtuous, yet human desires often clashed with these ideals. Extramarital affairs, indulgence in vices, and morally questionable decisions could be construed as evidence of sin, corruption, or weakness. Chroniclers, clerics, and political rivals documented these lapses, ensuring that personal behavior could have profound public and historical consequences. In a society where divine judgment was intertwined with governance, scandal was not merely social, it was existential, threatening the king's legitimacy both in life and in the eyes of history. The manipulation of secrets was a common political tool. Kings sometimes concealed alliances, illegitimate children, or brutal decisions to maintain appearances. Yet the very act of hiding such truths created tension and fear, as the risk of exposure loomed perpetually. Revelations, whether genuine or fabricated, could destabilize alliances, provoke rebellions, or tarnish reputations. For example, rumors surrounding Richard III and the disappearance of his nephews created a historical scandal that persists centuries later, blending fact and legend, personal ambition, and political intrigue. Secrets, once hidden, could become weapons against the king himself. Even seemingly mundane behavior could become scandalous under the wrong circumstances. Kings' indulgences in food, gambling, hunting, or personal eccentricities were scrutinized by both peers and chroniclers. A minor lapse in etiquette could be portrayed as evidence of weakness. An extravagant purchase could be painted as corruption. Every action, every preference, and every habit was subject to interpretation, creating an environment in which the king's private life was constantly politicized. The psychological effects of living with secrets and scandals were profound. Kings became increasingly paranoid, suspicious, and manipulative, often isolating themselves to maintain control. Trust was nearly impossible. Every relationship carried potential betrayal. Scandal reinforced the perception that power was dangerous not only from enemies abroad but also from those closest at hand. For many rulers, the pressure to maintain appearances contributed to mental instability, cruelty, and obsessive behavior. Yet scandal could also serve as a tool of control. Kings sometimes weaponized the threat of exposure, using secrets to intimidate, manipulate, or coerce courtiers and rivals. By demonstrating knowledge of hidden transgressions, the monarch reinforced authority, instilling fear that personal indiscretions could have lethal consequences. In this sense, the very mechanisms that threatened kings' secrecy, gossip, and scandal were transformed into instruments of power. In the end, secrets and scandals were inseparable from medieval kingship. They revealed rulers whose private desires, indulgences, and indiscretions could shape politics as much as armies or decrees. The palace, though majestic, was a crucible of hidden behaviors and dangerous knowledge, where trust was fragile, fear was constant, and every whisper could shift the balance of power. For the king, the management of secrets was not optional. It was survival, a daily negotiation between indulgence, reputation, and control, highlighting the disturbing reality that absolute power was as much about hiding flaws as wielding authority. Torture and terror. For medieval kings, fear was as vital a tool as armies, laws, or gold. The throne was maintained not only by loyalty, but by the careful cultivation of terror, and rulers often employed torture and public punishment as instruments to reinforce authority. In a world without modern policing or institutions, cruelty was both deterrent and spectacle, shaping the minds of subjects, courtiers, and even the king himself. The administration of pain was not a peripheral act. It was central to the disturbing psychology of medieval power. Torture was an essential feature of justice and intimidation. Kings sanctioned and often orchestrated extreme punishments designed to extract confessions, intimidate potential traitors, and publicly demonstrate authority. Devices such as the rack, the Iron Maiden, and the breaking wheel became symbols of the monarch's reach, serving as grim reminders that no subject was beyond his power. The public nature of many punishments amplified their effect. Entire communities witnessed the consequences of defiance, reinforcing obedience through fear. Punishment was meticulously calculated to terrify. Execution methods varied not only by crime but by social status, intent, and political message. Hanging, beheading, dismemberment, and burning were performed with a chilling awareness of spectacle, designed to leave lasting impressions. Even minor offenses could invite disproportionate retribution if the king sought to demonstrate strength. In this sense, cruelty was strategic, psychological, and deeply entwined with governance. Kings became both magistrates and performance artists, staging terror to secure compliance. The administration of torture also revealed the darker aspects of a ruler's personality. Some kings derived personal satisfaction from witnessing pain, interpreting suffering as proof of obedience or control. Richard III, for example, was reputed to enjoy the spectacle of punishment, while Ivan the Terrible's Oprichniki terrorized his subjects at his direct behest. The act of inflicting fear and observing its consequences became an extension of the king's power, blurring the line between governance and sadism. For rulers already burdened by paranoia and obsession, torture was both a tool and an emotional outlet. Terror extended beyond punishment into ritual and symbolism. Public executions, displays of mutilated bodies, and the exhibition of captured enemies reinforced hierarchy and demonstrated that rebellion carried consequences beyond personal loss. Kings understood that fear was contagious. Subjects, nobles, and even visiting dignitaries absorbed the lesson that defiance, ambition, or disloyalty could result in immediate and extreme reprisal. In this context, the administration of pain became a form of psychological control, a method of shaping behavior through dread rather than reason. Courtiers were particularly vulnerable to the interplay of terror and favoritism. A single misstep, a failed proposal, a poorly timed joke, or a slight misreading of the king's mood could provoke severe punishment. The unpredictability of wrath reinforced loyalty, creating a court in which obedience was constantly tested and paranoia became instinct. Advisors and nobles learned that survival required not only competence but an almost obsessive vigilance, carefully balancing ambition with fear. The psychological toll of ruling through terror was profound. Kings who relied heavily on cruelty often became isolated, unable to trust anyone, including family and close advisors. Paranoia, obsession, and the constant threat of rebellion intertwined, producing rulers who were increasingly detached from humanity, empathy, and moral restraint. Yet, in their minds, these actions were rational, necessary defenses against the ever-present specter of treachery, rebellion, or assassination. Fear became both protective and destructive, a mechanism to secure power while slowly eroding the king's sense of balance and sanity. Even when not actively governing, the shadow of terror loomed. Rituals, ceremonies, and daily court life were infused with reminders of the king's capacity for punishment. Protocol, etiquette, and obedience were forms of subtle coercion. Minor infractions were warnings, and lapses were signals of potential doom. In such an environment, the very architecture of the court throne rooms, dungeons, and public squares became instruments of psychological domination, ensuring that fear permeated every aspect of life. In the end, torture and terror were inseparable from medieval kingship. They were not merely punitive tools but extensions of the ruler's mind, reflections of obsession, paranoia, and the imperative to control. Pain, fear, and spectacle maintained authority, secured loyalty, and reinforced the king's place atop a fragile hierarchy. The disturbing reality is that for many medieval rulers, governance was a performance of cruelty, and power itself was inseparable from terror. To wear the crown was to wield fear as effectively as any weapon, ensuring that the specter of violence loomed over every decision, every alliance, and every subject of the kingdom. Isolation and loneliness. For all the grandeur and spectacle of medieval kingship, the life of a ruler was often profoundly lonely. The crown granted dominion over lands, armies, and subjects, yet it simultaneously imposed boundaries that isolated the monarch from genuine human connection. Friends, family, and even advisors were constantly measured against loyalty, ambition, and political expediency. In the gilded cage of the palace, kings learned early that trust was dangerous and intimacy could be fatal. Isolation was not merely a social reality, it was a psychological consequence of absolute authority, shaping behavior, decisions, and the darker tendencies of their reigns. From childhood, princes were taught the precarious nature of trust. Many grew up surrounded by tutors, mentors, and advisors. Yet these relationships were often as much about observation and control as care or education. Parents and regents sometimes manipulated young heirs for their own gain, sowing early seeds of suspicion. By the time a prince ascended the throne, he had learned to conceal emotions, guard words, and navigate a world where alliances shifted constantly. The formative years of kingship instilled both brilliance and wariness, producing rulers who excelled in strategy but struggled with intimacy. Even family relationships offered no refuge. Siblings, cousins, and offspring could be potential rivals or instruments in political scheming. The struggle for succession often transformed familial bonds into sources of anxiety and fear. Edward II of England, for example, faced rebellion fueled by tensions between personal attachments and political necessity, illustrating how close relationships could be as threatening as any battlefield. Kings were forced to weigh affection against survival, often choosing the cold calculus of power over emotional connection. Advisors and courtiers, too, were both allies and potential threats. Kings relied on them for counsel, yet the stakes were always perilously high. Misjudgment could mean betrayal, manipulation, or death. This tension created an environment of constant vigilance. Rulers could not afford the vulnerability of trust, and every interaction became a test of loyalty, subtlety, and discretion. The resulting isolation was psychological as well as social, as kings carried the burdens of decision-making alone, often without counsel that could be fully trusted. Loneliness was compounded by the relentless responsibilities of rule. Kings were expected to maintain order, wage war, administer justice, and protect succession. Every choice had consequences, often of life and death, and the burden of this responsibility left little room for personal companionship. Leisure, when it existed, was tightly controlled, performed under scrutiny, and often intertwined with politics. Even pleasures such as hunting, feasting, or art were shadowed by vigilance and protocol, reinforcing the isolation inherent in absolute authority. The psychological toll of this solitude was significant. Isolation bred paranoia, obsessive behavior, and emotional detachment. Kings often developed compulsive routines to assert control over their environment, seeking reassurance in ritual, ceremony, or surveillance. Mental health issues, melancholia, delusions, and erratic behavior were exacerbated by this enforced seclusion. In many cases, the crown itself became both companion and tormentor, a source of power that demanded constant attention and a constant reminder of loneliness. Religious and spiritual practices sometimes offered solace, yet even faith could reinforce isolation. Kings often turned to priests, monks, or oracles for guidance, but these figures were selected for loyalty and obedience, rather than intimacy. Spiritual counsel could never replace genuine human connection, and reliance on advisors, omens, or ritual only highlighted the social and emotional distance inherent in the throne. Even piety could become a mechanism to cope with loneliness, rather than a source of comfort or guidance. Paradoxically, isolation could also intensify cruelty and paranoia. The fewer people a king trusted, the more extreme measures were often taken to ensure loyalty. Executions, purges, and displays of terror were both defensive and performative, reinforcing the king's authority while reflecting his internal anxieties. Solitude, in essence, became both the product and reinforcement of the disturbing behaviors that defined medieval rulership. In the end, the life of a medieval king was gilded, exalted, and terrifyingly lonely. Absolute power offered dominion over millions, yet it demanded an emotional and social sacrifice few could endure. Isolation, paranoia, and mistrust shaped not only policy and courtly life, but the very psychology of the monarch. Behind the splendor of palaces, feasts, and ceremonies lay a profound solitude, a constant awareness that genuine companionship was perilous, and that every relationship carried the shadow of danger. For kings, loneliness was not incidental. It was a defining feature of power itself. The dark obsessions. The life of a medieval king was not defined solely by political maneuvering or military conquest. It was equally shaped by the compulsions, fixations, and secret obsessions that consumed the monarch's private hours. Power, wealth, and isolation provided fertile ground for eccentricities that were often harmless, but in many cases they veered into deeply disturbing territory. These obsessions reveal a troubling intersection of psychology, paranoia, and privilege, illuminating a side of kingship far darker than crowns and banners ever suggest. One of the most common obsessions was control. Kings sought absolute dominion over every aspect of life in their realm, from the loyalty of courtiers to the minutiae of daily rituals. Every gesture, dress code, and procedure in court life was monitored and enforced with obsessive precision. Slight deviations could provoke reprimand, imprisonment, or even execution. Edward IV of England, for instance, was known for obsessively reviewing court finances and personal records, ensuring that no detail, no matter how minor, was overlooked. In these acts, compulsion and governance intertwined, reflecting a psyche shaped by paranoia and an unyielding desire for mastery. Luxury, collection, and accumulation were other frequent obsessions. Kings collected art, jewels, manuscripts, and exotic animals, often indulging in extravagant displays designed to assert dominance or immortalize their reigns. These collections were rarely just decorative. They symbolized status, control, and the ability to manipulate both perception and reality. Some monarchs' obsession with opulence verged on pathological, consuming resources and attention to the detriment of more practical concerns, revealing a mind caught between aesthetic pleasure and compulsive accumulation. Sexual obsession was another dimension of royal fixation. Many kings pursued relationships that were excessive, exploitative, or politically motivated. Mistresses, illegitimate children, and clandestine liaisons were common. Yet some monarchs' desires manifested in behaviors considered deeply abnormal or scandalous even by contemporary standards. Henry VIII's obsessive pursuit of heirs, which led to multiple executions and annulments, exemplifies how sexual desire could intersect with paranoia, power, and cruelty. In these cases, obsession was inseparable from governance, influencing both domestic and political decisions. Kings were also prone to ritualized behaviors and superstitions. Ceremonial practices, personal habits, and even dietary routines could become obsessive, governed by the belief that deviation would result in misfortune or death. Charles VI of France, convinced at times that he was made of glass, restricted his movements and engaged in ritualistic precautions to avoid injury. Ivan IV of Russia maintained elaborate inspections and rituals to ensure loyalty, punishing any perceived breach with brutal consequences. These obsessions were both protective and symptomatic, reflecting deep-seated anxiety shaped by isolation, responsibility, and paranoia. Hunting and blood sports often became outlets for obsession. Kings pursued elaborate hunts that were as much about personal mastery as entertainment. Animals, prey, and participants were instruments in a performance that reinforced authority, satisfied compulsions, and offered controlled opportunities for violence. These activities often blurred the line between sport and cruelty, providing insight into a monarch's psyche and the unsettling interplay between pleasure, dominance, and obsession. The psychological toll of these fixations was significant. Kings who became consumed by obsession often alienated advisors, family, and subjects. Paranoia intensified, as control and perfection were pursued at all costs. The mind of the ruler became a self-contained laboratory of fear, desire, and compulsive action, producing behaviors that could be destructive, unpredictable, and terrifying to those within the orbit of the throne. Even seemingly minor obsessions could have political consequences. An insistence on protocol, ritual, or the appearance of loyalty could trigger conflict or rebellion if courtiers misinterpreted intent. Personal fixations thus became inseparable from governance, illustrating how deeply the private psychology of kings could shape the fate of entire kingdoms. In the end, the dark obsessions of medieval kings illuminate a world where power, privilege, and isolation converged to magnify the human psyche's fragility. Compulsions and eccentricities were not mere quirks, they were reflections of fear, ambition, and the pressures of absolute authority. In the gilded cage of the palace, obsession became a mechanism for control, a source of pleasure, and a potential catalyst for cruelty, revealing the disturbing reality of life behind the crown. Paranoia and spies. In the medieval court, paranoia was more than a psychological quirk, it was a necessary condition of survival. For kings, power was absolute but precarious, and betrayal could emerge from any quarter: advisors, family, allies, or even servants. To protect themselves, rulers developed intricate systems of surveillance, cultivated networks of informants, and treated suspicion as both a strategy and a survival instinct. Spies were the lifeblood of the court, feeding the king information that was essential for maintaining authority, yet also intensifying fear and obsession. Medieval kings often surrounded themselves with trusted agents tasked with monitoring the loyalty of courtiers, household staff, and regional governors. These networks extended far beyond the palace, encompassing nobles, soldiers, merchants, and clergy. The role of a spy was not merely to gather intelligence, it was to uncover potential conspiracies, threats, or disloyalty before it became irreversible. This constant vigilance reflected a broader reality. In a world where succession was contested and rivalries lethal, ignorance could be fatal. Paranoia was reinforced by the prevalence of intrigue. Assassination, rebellion, and plots were not exceptional. They were routine features of medieval politics. Kings lived under the constant awareness that those closest to them could harbor ambition or resentment. Ivan IV of Russia's oprichniki, for example, operated as an organized network of terror and surveillance, allowing the Tsar to root out perceived threats with ruthless efficiency. Similarly, Richard III of England navigated a court rife with alliances that shifted overnight, each rumor and whispered word carrying potential danger. In such a world, the line between truth and suspicion became dangerously blurred. The presence of spies affected behavior at every level. Kings scrutinized conversations, gestures, and even facial expressions, searching for hidden meaning. Advisors and courtiers quickly learned to mask their thoughts, cultivating elaborate strategies of flattery, compliance, or deception to survive. Paradoxically, the very act of relying on informants often increased mistrust. Each piece of intelligence could be truthful or manipulated, fueling cycles of fear and overreaction. The king's mind, constantly evaluating threats, became a crucible of paranoia, shaping both personal behavior and political decisions. Fear of betrayal extended even to family. Siblings, children, and cousins could be rivals for the throne, and intimate bonds often masked hidden ambitions. Edward II's troubled relationships with his barons and his perceived favoritism toward companions highlight the dangerous intersection of personal attachment and political vulnerability. In such an environment, the king's suspicion was not irrational. It was a defensive necessity, a strategy calibrated to ensure survival and maintain the fragile hierarchy of power. Surveillance also influenced justice and punishment. Kings often relied on confessions extracted through interrogation, espionage, or coercion to identify disloyalty. Torture, public humiliation, and execution were tools not only of discipline, but of psychological reinforcement. By demonstrating the consequences of betrayal, the ruler communicated a clear message. Loyalty was essential, and deception carried lethal risks. Fear and observation became intertwined, creating a court in which compliance was enforced through constant awareness of scrutiny. Yet the psychological consequences were profound. Kings consumed by paranoia often became isolated, unpredictable, and prone to violent outbursts. Their obsession with control could alienate allies, provoke rebellion, or trigger impulsive acts of cruelty. The very mechanisms designed to protect power, the spy network, the secret intelligence, the constant vigilance, also contributed to mental strain, making the ruler both omnipotent and vulnerable. Isolation and suspicion became self-reinforcing, transforming paranoia into a permanent state of mind. The presence of spies also distorted trust, reshaping the dynamics of the court. Relationships were filtered through layers of observation, loyalty tests, and hidden agendas. Every word, gesture, and decision was potentially monitored, evaluated, and recorded. Kings learned to act cautiously. But the fear of betrayal lingered even in moments of repose, coloring decisions in ways that could seem irrational, excessive, or terrifying to those around them. In the end, paranoia and spies were inseparable from medieval kingship. Surveillance was a tool of survival, yet it also magnified fear, isolation, and psychological strain. The crown granted power, but demanded constant vigilance. The throne offered authority, but at the cost of personal peace. Kings lived in a world where knowledge was both protective and corrosive, where every whisper could conceal treachery, and where the human mind became a battlefield as intricate and dangerous as the realm it governed. In understanding the role of spies and paranoia, we see how the pressures of absolute authority shaped not only policy but the very nature of the monarch's psyche. The weight of guilt, power, privilege, and fear were constant companions of the medieval king, but so too was guilt. Behind the gilded halls, grand ceremonies, and displays of authority lay the profound psychological burden of having blood on one's hands. Kings were often the architects of executions, betrayals, wars, and policies that resulted in suffering or death. While these acts might have been politically necessary, or at least justified in their eyes, the human mind does not always accept morality in black and white. Guilt, whether conscious or repressed, shaped behavior, decisions, and sometimes the course of entire reigns. From the earliest years of rule, kings were confronted with moral dilemmas that had no easy answers. Rebels, traitors, and rivals were dealt with harshly, often publicly, to assert authority. Yet the knowledge that human lives were being destroyed for the sake of power created internal tension. Edward II's favoritism towards certain courtiers, and the subsequent violence against their perceived enemies, illustrates the personal and political complexities that could weigh heavily on a monarch. Each execution, exile, or confiscation of property was both a strategic decision and a moral choice one, with long-term emotional consequences. War, too, contributed heavily to the weight of guilt. Battles demanded not only strategy and courage, but the acceptance of mass death. Kings commanded armies that could slaughter thousands, often in pursuit of territorial gain, dynastic security, or personal prestige. Victories might expand power, yet the cost in human life was staggering. Even when victory was celebrated, kings often faced the private reckoning of having caused the deaths of men, women, and sometimes children. Success could not erase the lingering sense of responsibility or the haunting memories of the battlefield. Executions and punishments created guilt that was closer to home. Many kings personally ordered the deaths of nobles, advisors, or family members, often to secure their reign or remove threats. Ivan IV of Russia's purges, Henry VIII's executions, and other similar examples demonstrate the intimate scale of violence wielded directly by the monarch. While fear and obedience reinforced authority, they could not eliminate the mental burden of knowing one's own actions caused suffering, injustice, or death. Even justified executions often left psychological scars, particularly when morality, religion, and personal conscience collided. Religion and spirituality intensified this sense of guilt. Medieval kings were expected to be divinely sanctioned and morally upright, yet their daily lives were often filled with acts of cruelty, betrayal, or indulgence. The contradiction between expected piety and practiced ruthlessness produced internal conflict. Kings sought absolution through prayer, indulgences, or public acts of charity, but these gestures often felt insufficient, leaving a lingering sense of moral unease. Some rulers, like Louis IX of France, immersed themselves in religion to cope with guilt, while others, like Charles VI of France, allowed paranoia and mental instability to grow unchecked under the weight of unresolved psychological strain. Even private indulgences and obsessions could contribute to guilt. Extramarital affairs, exploitation of subjects, and indulgence in cruelty were not just political issues, they were moral transgressions that kings internalized, sometimes obsessively. The tension between desire, ambition, and conscience produced behaviors that oscillated between calculation and compulsion. Guilt was not external alone. It became a private torment, shaping sleep, thought, and emotional stability. The psychological consequences of guilt were profound. Kings could become isolated, melancholic, or erratic. Some rulers attempted to alleviate their conscience through public works, religious devotion, or charity. But these acts were rarely sufficient to erase the awareness of lives destroyed by their decisions. Mental health deteriorated as guilt compounded paranoia, obsession, and fear, producing monarchs whose brilliance was inseparable from psychological strain. In the end, the weight of guilt illustrates the human dimension of medieval kingship. The crown granted power, privilege, and dominion, yet it also imposed an inescapable burden, the knowledge that every decision could produce suffering, loss, and death. The throne was not merely a seat of authority. It was a psychological crucible in which morality, ambition, fear, and conscience collided. Kings were not immune to remorse or reflection, and even the most ruthless rulers carried private awareness of the human cost of power. For medieval kings, guilt was inseparable from the crown. It haunted private moments, influenced decisions, and intensified the psychological toll of ruling. Power may have been absolute, but conscience and the relentless knowledge of human suffering ensured that the lives of monarchs were as mentally and emotionally demanding as they were politically treacherous. The lonely end. The end of a medieval king's life was often as disturbing and solitary as the years spent securing the throne. After decades of fear, paranoia, cruelty, and obsession, many rulers faced their final days in isolation, haunted by the consequences of their actions. Allies turned to enemies, courtiers became wary, and even family members were potential rivals. The crown, once a symbol of absolute power, became a heavy burden, highlighting the stark truth that no authority could protect a man from death, disease, or the judgment of history. Kings who survived long reigns often endured declining health, both physical and mental. Chronic illnesses, battlefield injuries, and the effects of long-term stress compounded the natural frailties of aging. Henry II of England suffered from debilitating ailments that left him reliant on attendants while still commanding decisions that could change the kingdom's fate. Similarly, Charles VI of France spent his final years in mental torment, alternating between delusion and lucidity, leaving his court to navigate the chaos his instability created. For these rulers, the physical realities of aging were inseparable from the psychological consequences of a life spent under constant pressure and fear. Isolation intensified as kings aged. Those who had once surrounded themselves with advisors and courtiers found that trust eroded over time. Generational shifts in the nobility, the rise of ambitious heirs, and lingering resentment from past cruelties created an environment where even loyal attendants were cautious. The fear of betrayal, assassination, or usurpation did not vanish with age. It often intensified, feeding paranoia and compounding loneliness. Kings became prisoners of their own power, surrounded yet profoundly alone, unable to reveal vulnerability without risk. Reflection on past actions often accompanied these final years, producing complex psychological and emotional states. Some kings confronted guilt over executions, betrayals, and wartime atrocities. Ivan IV of Russia reportedly wrestled privately with the consequences of his purges, recognizing too late the human cost of his reign. Others, like Henry VIII, may have attempted to rationalize cruelty and obsession as necessary for maintaining power, though the burden of conscience remained a shadow that followed to the very end. For many, the realization that immortality existed only in memory, never in flesh, was a sobering and isolating truth. Fear remained constant. Death, disease, and political vulnerability loomed over the terminal years. Kings took extraordinary precautions to protect themselves, relying on guards, fortifications, and surveillance even when the body and mind could barely sustain the effort. Ivan the Terrible continued purges late in life, partly to enforce loyalty, but also to stave off the anxiety of mortality. The crown, once a seat of authority, became a cage, highlighting the paradox of absolute power. The more control a king wielded, the more acutely aware he was of his own vulnerability. Some monarchs sought solace in religion, ritual, or devotion, attempting to reconcile a life of violence, obsession, and cruelty with spiritual beliefs. Chapels, prayers, pilgrimages, and charitable acts were both genuine expressions of faith and attempts to assuage guilt and fear. Louis IX of France devoted his final years to religious works and reflection, illustrating the human need to find meaning and redemption at life's end. Yet even the most pious rulers could not escape the psychological weight of past actions or the inevitability of death. The death of a king often brought dramatic shifts in the kingdom. Succession crises, power struggles, and rebellion were common, underscoring that even the ultimate authority could not secure stability beyond the grave. The very measures taken to maintain life alliances, purges, espionage, were meaningless in the face of mortality. Death exposed the fragility of human power and the ultimate isolation of those who wield it. In the end, the lonely end of a medieval king encapsulates the disturbing reality of life behind the crown. Absolute authority demanded vigilance, cruelty, and obsession, producing a life marked by isolation, paranoia, and psychological strain. Even when surrounded by wealth, armies, and splendor, the ruler often confronted mortality alone, burdened by guilt, fear, and reflection on choices that shaped both the kingdom and his own conscience. The throne offered dominion over life and death, yet it could not shield a king from solitude, regret, or the inescapable truth that death would come for all, regardless of power. In these final hours, the human cost of medieval kingship, its obsessions, cruelties, and fears, was laid bare, revealing a crown that protected, demanded, and isolated in equal measure. The disturbing reality of medieval rule was that the greater the power, the heavier the weight, and the lonelier the end. Life behind the crown was far darker than pageantry or power suggests. Medieval kings were human, yet consumed by fear, obsession, cruelty, and paranoia. Absolute authority isolated them, distorted their minds, and imposed a psychological toll few could endure. Loyalty was fragile. Family could be a threat, and every decision carried devastating consequences. The throne was both a symbol of power and a gilded prison, magnifying paranoia, cruelty, and guilt. Their lives remind us that power can corrupt, isolation can warp the mind, and ambition can consume the soul. The greater the power, the heavier the cost, and behind every crown, there was a life both brilliant and haunting.